enough experience and show them a career path that's possible beyond a couple of years out, that's the rock I think we're going to perish on.
We've got workforce shortages at the moment, and it is hard to get people on the ground, and we've got a lot of competition in the lace space, and whether we try and incorporate those people into what we're doing in mixed practice or we don't. I think we're at a bit of a crossroads at the moment.
So I Heard, a podcast for cattle vets, students and anyone interested in the dairy and beef industries. It's been brought to you by the Australian Cattle Vets, a special interest group of the Australian Veterinary Association. I'm agricultural journalist Prue Adams. Hello there, and thanks for joining me for this second series of So I Heard. We're coming to you from the Australian Cattle Vets Conference in Brisbane. Over the next 5 episodes, I'll be chatting with an incredible lineup of practitioners from Australia and overseas. So let's kick off with a panel you'll be sure to get a laugh out of, but they also bring a wealth of experience and they might even hit on a few sore points.
Yeah, there could be a little bit of blood on the floor before it's all done still.
Stay tuned until the end, though, for solid advice for veterinary students and early career vets. Welcome, all of you. This is the first episode of the second series of So I Heard. So let's start by quickly introducing yourselves with 30 words or less so that the listeners can get used to your voices and put a voice to a name.
Thanks, Prue. Paul Cusack, Australian Livestock Production Services. I'm a ruminant nutritionist and veterinarian based near Cowra, and I wander about the eastern states of Australia mostly with intensive and a little bit of extensive ruminant production systems.
My name's Scott Parry. I'm a private veterinarian. I have the auspiciously named business Silverback Vet Services, referring mostly to my advanced age and status in the industry. But I owned a private practice with my wife Kylie, who's also a vet in northwest New South Wales for 20 odd years, and sold up 3 or 4 years ago. And now I gamble, drink and live off my wits, which comprises contracting to government bodies and working in Northern Australia during the dry season.
Hi Prue, thanks very much for having us. I'm Stacey Ray. I'm a mixed practitioner from based at Monto in southern central Queensland, and I love all things about mixed practice. I'm also a director of Evergene, which is a reproductive company that's based here in Brisbane, and sounds like I need to hang out with Scotty a bit more.
So going back to you, Paul, now you're, if I might say, the oldie of the group with a really extensive background in nutrition and health interactions in feedlot cattle in particular. And you have 2 businesses, so you're still super busy. Tell me about what got you to where you are now.
That's an interesting path. It was in final year of vet, having been an undergraduate for 8 years because I did a science degree first. I remember sitting in a lecture theatre and swearing that I would never do any more study ever again, but then I got on to an internship with Queensland University out at the Pastoral Vet Centre at Gundawindi, and part of that was a coursework masters where there was the opportunity to study all the things that I was actually really interested in. So I pursued that, and one of those subjects was ruminant nutrition. And after finishing the masters, my supervisor for meat science actually suggested I do a PhD in meat science, which I started, but then I changed over to nutrition with time. While I was working with the vet centre at Gundawindi, I started doing a little bit of work with feedlots, and that's where the feedlot consultancy business grew from.
You divide the consultancy from your vet practice, don't you?
We have a general mixed practice in town, and in the past we've actually kept them quite distinct, but we're now starting to get a bit more interaction between the 2 businesses. So there is a bit of crossover now, and I think that's probably something we can increase with time, particularly since I'm flat strap.
Yeah, you're busy. You are busy with both the businesses, and you have a few side hustles as well, don't you?
I'm a beef producer on weekends, which is probably the lot of a lot of veterinarians, frustrated farmers. But I also do some undergraduate and postgraduate teaching. So between those things, it can make me rather stretched. There's a good opportunity too, though, with having the clinic base to give some new graduates or recent graduates their grounding in general practice, but to give them a taste of the consultancy side to see if they want to actually pursue that any more extensively. So we're working towards that over time.
Scott, so you overlap with Paul, I understand. You're both in academia together?
I went through Queensland University at the same time that Paul was working at the Pastoral Vet Centre. So Paul was one of my lecturers, tutors, yeah.
We mainly overlap in drinking and gambling.
There's a theme here.
Yeah, yes, very much so.
So you stayed with mixed practice for a lot longer?
Yeah, basically mixed practice, and I've done a little bit of everything. I tell people my NRL analogy is Kevin Campion. He played 242 first grade games for 6 different clubs, and I'm a little bit the same way. I think I've worked in a number of different practices. I've spent time in intensive dairy practice in Australia and the UK, but the majority of my time has been in pastoral vet practice.
It's a big question, but how have you seen it change over that time, over the last few decades?
Mixed practice. Yeah, it's hard to know where to start there. I mean, I think there's been a move away. I don't think we do as much individual animal work probably as we used to. You know, like a mixed practice like ours based at Canamble in northwest New South Wales, you know, some of those years in the early 2000s, we might have done 150, 200 calvings a year, and they do nowhere near that now. I think there has been a move away from that for a variety of reasons. Well, certainly it doesn't take up the time that it used to in mixed practice. That's been one thing. I think probably less practices are doing more of the production animal work in that mixed practice field. I think the days of there being a vet clinic at every stick and stump through west of the Newell there, those days are over, and particularly practices that used to do a bit of everything. So I think there's been a consolidation of that. I think there's a lot of production animal work still being done out of mixed practices, but there are less practices that are doing it, if that makes sense. And then I suppose in terms of seismic changes, things that I think have been big has been the corporatisation of mixed animal practice in the last 10 years, I guess, maybe a bit more. We probably lagged behind the UK. That's the other country have more experience in with that. But yeah, we've rapidly corporatised. So, you could go on with that topic forever, mate, but they would be a few things that I've seen that have definitely changed.
Perhaps people were more forgiving in another time. The client was perhaps more forgiving in another time. Do you think that's the case?
Oh, yeah, I think definitely, Prue. Just to slightly digress, you asked Paul how he got where he was, and how I got where I was I think I chose some really good early career mentors, but I must have given them like grey hair and hair loss, like some of the things that we pulled on, like surgeries and stuff you had no right doing, but it was a different time and it was more forgiving, and there was just more room to have a crack at things. And yeah, I mean, the whole of society's changed like that, hasn't it? There's less tolerance for that. There's information is more available. You can go onto YouTube and some half-wit will be telling you what should or shouldn't be done, and you're automatically compared to that. So yeah, I think that's been a definite change. But society has changed, and we've just been swept up in it.
It's probably a good place to bring you in, Stacey, as the sort of most recent past president for a start, and probably the most recent vet graduate, although still, a little while ago. How have you seen things change?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with what Scott just said. It's rapidly changing, especially with technology, and I've seen that happen just in the last few years especially. And so I think we are treating less individual animals, and we are treating more of production animal systems in the production animal space. And I'm obviously in a mixed practice where we are 60% large animals and 40% smallies, but there's less of practices like mine around. And I hear it from the students all the time that they're finding it harder and harder if they're interested in production animals to actually find practices that they can go and get experience at and that they can seek employment with post-graduation. So I think, I would agree with what you're saying and how things are kind of changing there. I think there's been a change in the dynamic of our workforce as well. So this year we've got more female members than we have had male members, than we do have male members. And there's a real changing dynamic in the workplace there for that as well, because we've got to navigate how we integrate women into rural practices for longevity and sustainability. And childcare is challenging in a lot of rural areas, and having staff work part-time means that we have to navigate a different work structure and a workflow and different rostering systems as well. So we potentially, as employers, have to have more staff on board than historically, what we would have had to have had.
One of the solutions I know you think is that there should be more postgraduate studies.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah.
How and in what?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the how or the what yet, really. It really leads back to what Scott was saying about there was more opportunity just to have a go. And clients were more willing to just let people have a go. And I do think there's a lot less of that. There's far more expectations from clients. So the ability for people just to have a crack is not really there. It needs to be done in a more controlled setting in some way. And I think I'd love to see in Australia that we have a better pathway postgraduate. So things that Paul's doing is absolutely fantastic. People who are wanting to work in that nutrition space, and I'd love to see it in the ART space. I mean, it's a reproduction conference, so there's been a lot of discussion here about when you graduate from university and you get a couple of years under your belt and you become more experienced, where do you go from there? And I think historically a lot of vets have gone overseas and they've studied in the US. At the moment it's challenging in Australia, and we have a lot of international vets who come and work in Australia that aren't accredited, and they're working as tech operators and they're more skilled than a lot of our vets. So I think it's a really important space, but I don't have the answers just yet.
I think there is a bit of an answer available there, and as I said before, I did the coursework masters at Queensland Uni, which gave me a really broad overview of a heap of different subjects, nutrition and meat science, obviously, epidemiology, ag economics, pastoral agronomy, pasture management systems, herd health systems, a big cross-section of all those really vital skills, advanced reproductive techniques as well. And now that that's gone from Queensland Uni, there's a screaming need for it. I tried to get something similar up and running at CSU without success. I think as an organisation, as a professional body, we probably need to make some representations to try to make those sorts of courses available. It's unclear to me why universities are reluctant to actually go back into those training pathways. They're incredibly valuable to me.
I totally agree, Cuse. My understanding was it comes back to how funding models work for postgraduate study, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those coursework masters don't produce a massive amount of research papers and what have you, as opposed to a research master's or PhD. And that was my understanding, was it was the way that postgraduate funding is structured in Australia has killed them off. Like even the Melbourne Uni Dairy coursework masters, which was a fantastic program as well, it's withered and died on the vine. So it's a big challenge, totally. But it's at a high level.
It is, and that's
isn't it?
certainly an issue. But it's just a matter of structuring the fees for the course so that it makes it viable. I'm sure we can make it work if we have cooperative universities, because there is a rip-roaring need.
There is.
Couldn't agree more.
One of the things that I think probably happens in the veterinary sector is that vets are taught at university how to be vets, but what about being consultants?
It's certainly not taught at uni, and I don't think there's the time and the space to actually do that. And I think in order to move into that sort of work, you really need postgraduate training. We can't possibly jam that into an undergraduate course. There's only a relatively small proportion of vets who actually go into consultancy. Perhaps we ought to think more about how we set up the systems for vets in practice to actually offer that extended service. And I can see Stacey nodding, and I think that's something that I can see you're moving on, and something that you also would have cultivated too, I'd imagine, Scott.
Yeah, the consultancy thing is, I always struggle with it, how to integrate it into a mixed practice. It's hard to make it pay the bills early on in the piece, and you need a certain size practice to support someone moving into that space. Correct me if I'm wrong, because like spaying cats and just preg testing cows still pays a lot of the bills. It's Q's, you've been around a little bit longer than me, not a lot, but we've been talking about this for the 30 years I've been coming to ACV conferences, how we've got to move into consultancy, we've got to do more with the data, do more with that, and we're still having the same conversations 30 years later. It's a bit of a Groundhog Day situation for me. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, but I'm just saying there's a lot of people we've discussed this a lot of times, and I don't know if has it changed a lot?
I think it is changing, and I only say that because we've got a lot of young vets here, and I listen to them, what they're sort of having discussions with over a few beers, and I think there is more data now, and so with more data, it's easier to analyse. And with all of the AI and the technology, it's certainly done more rapidly, I think. And so when data analysis can be done more rapidly and we've got bigger data sets, I think it's easier to do, and it's definitely happening more and more. We were at an ultrasound workshop on the weekend, and that was an ACV workshop that we organised, and I was saying, in practice we're body condition scoring and we're gestationally ageing our herds, but it's a problem collecting the data, and by the time you get back to the practice and you're trying to get that information out to your clients in histograms and forward forecast things, and then once, if the results are poor, then you're doing a disease investigation. It just takes a long time. And whilst we were there, one of the delegates actually put some stuff into ChatGPT, and he actually came up on the spot on his phone with a spreadsheet that we could tap that actually did all of that on the spot. So we condition scored and gestationally aged the pregnancies that we were ultrasounding, and he pressed send, and it created a histogram on the spot. So I know that's not really at the consultancy level, but that's at the very start of where we're actually starting to move into. There's some really creative minds that are working with tech that I think will change rapidly in the coming years.
Oh, sorry, I was probably being just more devil's advocate there before. But yeah, it's definitely happening, and you're right. There is a data, what my mate Mick Chambers talks about, the data tsunami that is coming at people. Like you work with some of these Northern Australian herds, you talk to I do a bit of work for some of those guys, and these corporates are capturing so many data points over tens, hundreds of thousands of cows. But again, like Stacey said, it's having the time and the capacity to actually do something with that data. There's a lot of data that's wasted, I think, that never sees the light of day. And there's a group of clients that just don't want it. They've got bigger fish to fry. Like they've got, a massive flood coming down the Fitzroy River, and they're not looking at histograms, they're looking at front-end loaders and that sort of thing, And so it's definitely a conversation probably for more bottles of wine than we've got here.
I didn't know we had bottles of wine.
Back to the drinks.
I think it's a valid point, though, that it's a difficult transition, and you've got me thinking back about how that pathway actually occurred for me, and I couldn't properly develop the consultancy side until I extracted myself from the clinic completely, because you just get too tied down with day-to-day issues. And I also have to confess that I had a few lean years. I was living on mince for a while until I got the client base.
A lot of neck chops.
Until I got the client base to a sufficient size. So it's tough in its initial stages for sure.
And I remember talking to Tristan Jubb, like another esteemed member of the profession who's probably gone fairly successful into consultancy. And I remember him saying, look, if you're going to do it as a vet, if you want to be a consultant, you've really got to cut a lot of all your ties with private practice and just do the consultancy thing if you want to be taken successfully. But that's a pretty brave move.
I just wonder, in this discussion, there's been a lot of talk at this conference about our role as vets changing and how we incorporate technicians potentially into our practice to do some of the legwork, and then the vet actually becomes the decision maker and the data analyzer and the consultant. So we're not completely removed from a mixed practice setting, but we become the overseer of the work that's happening. I know they're the discussions that are certainly being had. We've got workforce shortages at the moment, and it is hard to get people on the ground, and we've got a lot of competition in the lay space, and whether we try and incorporate those people into what we're doing in mixed practice or we don't. I think we're at a bit of a crossroads at the moment.
I think one of the massive challenges we have is that we've got all this work that vets can potentially be doing. Like everyone who's in the mixed large animal, production animal space, I think is busier than they've ever been, doing more production work than they've ever done, to the point where we almost don't have the capacity. Well, not almost, we don't have the capacity to cover all the work that comes in. So that's a concern. So I can see where the argument for lay operators comes from, definitely, and I think it's valid. But the inherent danger, in my opinion, in offloading too much of that legwork to the lay operator is the way, as a young vet, and all of us could attest to this, you've got to spend time at the crease to get credibility and understanding of production systems. You've got to be there and grind those hard yards out in the yards doing that legwork. And if we produce a generation of vets who think that they're going to just come out and be overseeing a team of technicians, I don't know if that's going to be sustainable. And that's the conundrum we're in, isn't it?
Yeah, and to back up that point, even with what I do with consultancy work, where it's I'm not expected to do a lot of hands-on things, I will grab a shovel and shovel bunks if the feed allocation is being made incorrectly, and we end up with a heap of old feed. And I think it's really important for young vets to realise that, just as you said, you've got to get in there and get your hands dirty with the people you're working with, because a lot of what I do is more coaching than issuing edicts. So, I think that's a really important point.
What do you think about that, Stacey, as a younger vet and a female vet? Do you agree with that approach, or do you think there's maybe a hybrid model there?
No, I do genuinely agree with that approach, and I think that's maybe because I might have an older mind and a younger body. That's how I grew up, I think, along those lines. And so I really...
You're very lucky. I think I have the inverse.
I think it's really important. I don't think you really understand the true depth of the problem unless you've kind of been there and you've been in it and you've done it yourself. So I think a hybrid model would obviously be the ideal scenario, Prue, but I'm not sure how we get to a hybrid model, because I think the hard yards do need to be done at the start for you to appreciate and be able to coach other people through that.
The conversations are being had, and we can't come up with all the answers. We're not going to come up with all the answers at once, but we're having the conversations where I think as a subset of the profession, we're aware of the challenges and the opportunities out there. Not everyone's going to do it. Some people are just going to stick to lifting tails and pulling calves and pushing prolapses back in and be very happy, thank you very much.
Are you seeing vets going through the university courses now wanting to be cattle vets? Are there just as many people wanting to go out into the field, or not so much as there were?
I think James Cook University and Charles Sturt University have had a really massive influence on that. My perception, and I know I'm up here in Queensland, but my perception is that there's actually a lot of vets who are really keen to get into mixed practice and rural practice, not necessarily just cattle. I think rural practice or mixed, where they do get to still do some small animal medicine. We have a lot of students come through our practice on placement, and they all say that to us, is that they still like doing a bit of smallies, but they really are interested in doing cattle and horse work still. So I feel like 5 years ago we weren't getting many students like that, but there's been in the last 5 years a real change and a real influx there.
I agree with Stace. I think there are enough students that want to go into mixed practice. I think they're out there. We need to give them, beyond the vet thing, we need to give them positive experiences in rural communities. That, to me, is the heart of it. You can bring a kid that's never been beyond Western Sydney or Ipswich, and if you give them a positive experience in a rural community, and as long as the job's okay and you're paying them reasonably well, you're going to stand a fair chance of keeping them. And if they're happy socially and you're not flogging them to death professionally, you're going to stand a fair chance of getting them and keeping them. And that's been a challenge throughout the pastoral industry, right from the stock camp to the vet thing. We get these kids, if we don't show them a good enough experience and show them a career path that's possible beyond a couple of years out, that's the rock I think we're going to perish on.
You're nodding, Stacey.
Oh, I 100% support that, yeah.
We touched on earlier about the corporatisation of veterinary, but also more specifically about for cattle vets. And I know it can be a touchy subject, but how has that changed this industry, your sector of the industry?
Probably have to choose our words diplomatically here. I'm just putting that out there. It's
You'll sighed deeply when I said that.
On one level, it gave a generation of practice owners who had big, successful practices that had almost got to the point, I wouldn't say they were unsaleable, but the only way those practice owners were probably going to realise the true value of that practice was to sell to a corporate. And I think that was a good thing for those people. And that changed the game a bit. It might have, the rising tide lifts all boats, and maybe it added value to some of our other practices too when they came in with the big, what we perceived at the time as being big dollars. I don't know. I think there might have been a bit of a brain drain, like some of those blokes who are my age, a bit older, who got out, they got good money for their businesses, good fair money for their businesses, and they got out after the work back period and might have created a bit of a knowledge vacuum maybe at the top of some of those practices. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to put your finger on it. I don't know. Stace, what's your thoughts?
I think the corporate model is really challenging in rural and mixed practice because practices are the foundation of them is built on the relationship with the producer and the grazier and your clients. And that's definitely happened, in the practices that I've experienced the corporate takeover with. It's been challenging because it has been, as Scott said, I'm in it at times too, because I'm two practices and I'm large and I'm struggling to get somebody who wants to partner with me in business, and I'm too big for somebody really to afford to buy me out on an individual basis. So I understand why people have sold out to corporates, but I just haven't seen it work well because they've done their couple of years and a lot of them have then moved on. And with that has gone the knowledge, and with that's gone the relationship. And then you've got a clinic full of young vets who are aspiring to be who the previous practice owner was, but there's nobody there to sort of lead and hold hands. And I don't mean nobody there, because I appreciate the corporate structure, of it, but in my experience and what I've seen, it hasn't gone well. And I think that maybe has driven a lot more vets back into private practice.
Has it?
I feel like it has, and my business is going really great because a lot of clients want to, work with us because we're privately owned and locally owned, and that's where they want to work, and that even clients want to work with private businesses like us. It's just my experience.
In my field, there was a lot of upheaval created by the arrival of corporatisation, which has to a large extent settled down. I don't think it's run its full cycle yet. I think there's still going to be, some changes as a result of that structural change, if you like. What I have found is that a lot of the larger corporate operators in the feedlot sector like dealing with corporates, and a lot of things happen at the board level that people who are working at the coalface don't actually get access to. So I'm not sure what the final outcome of that is going to be. I think over time, I suspect there will be a bit of a move back towards private operators, and I've seen a little bit of that happen already. So it's yet to be seen what happens.
Yeah, there could be a little bit of blood on the floor before it's all done still.
There may well be.
Like Q said, I think there's a bit to play out here because it's still a reasonably immature industry, I guess, particularly in the mixed side of things. And I think some of them have done a really good job transitioning from privately owned to corporate, and some of them it hasn't played out quite so well. I think they reckoned it was going to be all beer and Skittles when they bought it, and I just think, like Stacey said, there's a lot of cult of personality involved in, particularly in production animal work. Not cult of personality, but people are really attached to. They want to talk to Paul, or they want to talk to Stacey, and that sort of thing. And the corporate McDonald's model of when you buy a hamburger in Brisbane or Beirut, it tastes the same and it's made the same way. It doesn't play out like that in mixed production animal practice, and I think that the corporates had sort of gambled on that McDonald's type of model working.
I guess finally, let's look to the future. Now, let's say you're talking to a final year vet student at the moment, or there is someone who's about to start their first job. With all the range of experience that the three of you have, how would you advise them? And I'll go first to you, Stacey.
I'd advise them to just get involved, to stay broad is what I would say to them, to, work on finding out who they are and what they like, and then go and cease that and try things because they might surprise themselves. It was definitely surprising to me in my career when I graduated. I found I liked things that I didn't think that I would, and I think it's nice to find a workplace where you're a good fit with the team and you work hard, with the team and for the team. I still think there's a really bright future, and you can make your career whatever you want it to be. You just need to understand what that means to you, and then you can go out there and seek it.
And what would you advise, Scott?
Stacey's wrapped it up pretty well, I think, but I alluded to earlier, I was lucky to work for some great people, and I think getting a good start in the profession is really important. Go somewhere where you're going to get good support, where you're going to get a crack at doing a bit of large animal work too, because there's mixed practices and there's mixed practices. Some of them, like a mixed practice that does 10% large animal work, you're probably going to spend a lot of time vaccinating cats and dogs. Sorry. If you want to do mixed work, go to somewhere like Stacey's, where you're going to get a bit of exposure, and choose that first job, those first couple of jobs well, because you see too many people still. I don't think it's as bad as it was, but you see too many young ones that get burnt in that first job, and like I said, they don't get a positive experience in the community either, and it's bloody hard to get them back. So choose that first job well, be eternally optimistic about it. You know, it is a good life. The profession, I say to people all the time, the profession has been exceptionally good to Kylie, myself and our family, and I would commend it to young people to give it a go.
I'm feeling inspired. I would say to them, definitely for the first couple of years, just nail down your mixed practice skills, get all that routine stuff done in both small animal and large animal, and exactly as Stacey said, work out where you want to go there, you know, once you've had that exposure, because you frequently end up not pursuing the pathway you thought you were going to pursue. I was going to be an ET vet. I was all set to do it, and I actually learned the procedure in my coursework masters, but then I started working with feedlots, and I started doing further training in nutrition, and I can't imagine I would have ever done anything different. So get the routine stuff under your belt and then have a look around, and maybe in a couple of years' time we might have some post-grad educational pathways for you. It's a work in progress.
It's a great place to end. Thank you all for your insights and your wisdom and your words of advice. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Prue.
No, thanks for having
Prue.
us.
This has been So I Heard, a podcast commissioned by the Australian Cattle Vets, a special interest group of the Australian Veterinary Association. Background briefings by Ian McDonald. Editing and post-production by Drew Radford at Pod Talk. Music by Stuart Day. I'm Prue Adams. Thanks for listening.